Welcome folks to our measurement webinar. Just a little measurement trick there. You see I've got the date, the 31st of October. I've got my times wrong, which is a good start. It is officially the 2nd of November, I've been led to believe. So welcome, and I hope you enjoy our time together. Measurement is a very broad theme, and I want to touch on a few things. Looking at a little bit of benchmarking, thinking about some sorts of activities you might be able to do from the forensic field. I want you to think about your own courses, and I also want to touch on issues about scale and units, and perhaps to leave you with one or two ideas. So let's begin, and welcome again. For a start, when we talk about benchmarks, these are those personalised measurement standards that we use. I can remember as a youngster being with my mum in one of those haberdashery shops, and one of the women behind the counter pulling the bolt of material across her and measuring yards of material. That was a benchmark for a yard. A metre is not much longer, but it also has its benchmark. Centimetres. A centimetre might be the width of your little fingernail. An inch might be something like, oops, if I get my hand right here, the length of the tip of your thumb. 1 to 2 millimetres might be the depth of a coin. We use time a lot. For example, a kettle, how long does that take to boil? 2 or 3 minutes, depending on what sort of element is in it. When you paint in summer, for a painted wall to become touch dry, it might be up to half an hour. And the bag you take to work each day, how heavy is that? So we all relate the physical things with us, whether it's time or length or weight or capacity, to recognisable quantities. When I talk about litres, I often refer to 2-litre bottles of milk, because that's in my mind's eye. And that's benchmarking. So that's my comparative tool. There's other informal benchmarks as well. Excuse me. For example, those of you who've been parents and have had little children, and you've run a bath for them, and you put your wrist into the bath water to test it, you know what's about right. You may not be able to say what the exact temperature is, but you know about it being about right. That's a benchmark. It's an informal one, but a very important one. Okay, let's move on. Some forensic ideas I've been thinking about, and I quite like these because with the raft of CSI programs being flogged around, it gives you a chance to perhaps go back in the past before they had DNA sampling, which is a marvellous tool, but it wasn't always around. And those old scientists knew relationships, in fact people knew relationships between parts of the body. For example, the length of a foot from your heel to your toe, is that about the same as the length of your forearm? You think about that, you might have been in a shoe shop and seen someone putting some footwear along their arm just to check the size. Another one you might want to look at and do with some learners is get them to measure the width across their shoulders. Also get them to measure their height. You might find the relationship there is about a quarter. However, don't tell them that. Collect some data and see if they can find a whole number of shoulder lengths that fit into their height. The third one I've got here is about adding lengths of fingers and thumbs, and that does add up to something that's quite close to the length of your arm, from shoulder to fingertip. Again, little things that you can get learners to do, and the important thing is this: if you do it in pairs or threes, it means you can observe them in action. Who actively does the measuring? If you find one person's doing the measuring, change the jobs around. so that someone's not just the sole recorder. But some people hide their measuring abilities by being or volunteering to be the recorder. Listen to the advice given between peers. It's quite interesting what they might say to each other when they're explaining how to drive a measuring tape or not. And if you need to step in to add something or to perhaps correct a misconception, that's the chance. But it's about observing and letting them run the show a little bit and respecting the knowledge they have within that activity. Let's move on to your own courses. This is a little bit trickier because with a recording like this, okay, what are the measures we want to expect from our own learners? Okay, we've got a couple of websites you can look at for imperial lengths. And I'll just bring that up because I don't think imperial lengths have left us altogether. In fact, I hope they haven't, because quite honestly, I think they're more interesting. The metric system was a wonderful system, but it is dull compared to imperial. Okay, that's a personal opinion. For example, if I go to get my tyres blown up, I'm using the air pressure valve there. PSI, pounds per square inch, is something I can relate to much easier than kilopascals. I went fishing recently and fortunate enough to get some snapper, and I knew that the limit was 25 centimetres in length. However, on my line I was using an 8-ounce sinker. So we have this sort of strange relationship that we haven't quite left the imperial, and it is around still. I would also urge you not to forget about locations and directions. We're always trying to find things. Okay? For instance, if you're telling someone how to get to a place, or saying to a colleague, yeah, I gave that to such and such, he or she is in room B17 or something like that, we're always given directions and locations. A chance also to look at measuring instruments being used. And one little favourite of mine is to set up what we call measurement stations. And you might have 3 or 4 quantities of length to be measured, 3 or 4 quantities of capacity, of weight, perhaps something of temperature. And if you put those around the room and people work together in 2s and 3s to go around the room and try those activities, it gives them a broader sense of measure. It also means that you can look at the interpretation of the scales in those measurement tools, which is not a given. The other thing, of course, is any calculating after measuring. For example, you might ask someone to work out a perimeter of a rectangular shape, a book, say, a book cover, and they might work out the individual measures. Do they add them, or have they clicked onto that doubling one length and doubling the width? There's a shortcut to that. So calculations derived from measuring are also very interesting to observe and listen into your learners. Let's move on to scale. Now, when we take readings, we do use those formal tools of rulers and weighing scales, jugs, cylinders, etc. However, some places are fortunate enough to have digital scales. That's terrific. I'll be very interested when you ask your learners what the units are on those scales. I've often seen some learners record the number, but have left the unit out because they're doubtful about what is actually on the scale itself. Not so much with length, but certainly with mass or weight, as it's more commonly called. The second part of the slide is the challenge to understand intervals. And we need to be very, very certain here, or very clear, how precise people need to be. For example, is 5 a good enough answer, or is 4.8 what was being asked for? It depends on the context. When they're also using the instruments, watch how they zero them. One little thing you might like to try is perhaps giving people broken rulers or cut tape measures. Say, hey, look, measure the length there, and then watch where they start. Do they start from a tidy number, or if they've got no idea and just line up the instrument against the length? Do they know which units, as we said before? Do they have some decimal place value in hand to try to make sense of a reading? For example, if they record a number, do they know the difference between 4.05 or 4.5? The scales and intervals, is everything in convenient tens, or are there some 4s and 8s thrown into the mix as well of intervals between key numbers? If you look at the two scales I've got there, the first one that runs from 4 to 5 and has 4.5 and 5.5 in it, is a scale of 10, or intervals of 10 between the whole numbers. The second one, though, is a scale of 8. So it's not a bad thing to try and check with your learners to say, well, how about at 4.5, what's the next number on the scale after 4.5? If they answer, oh, it's got to be 4.6, then they have some sort of inkling about decimals. The second scale, which is broken up into 8 parts between 122 and 123, if you suggested perhaps to look at the next mark after 122.5, see what happens. If someone says 122.6, ask them how they work that out. If they're not sure, then you have some work to do on decimals and understanding fractions. So measurement, although we like to think it's a matter of getting a quantity and measuring it, has some hidden little traps for learners. We need to be aware of that and encourage them to at least have a go, but also walk alongside them and say, hey, look, have you thought about this sort of stuff? Okay? So this is a bit of a potpourri, I guess, of ideas, but it's perhaps the messages are to give learners chances to be active in measuring, not just to sit back and be told what to do, and to make mistakes. It's not a bad thing to do. One other thing we've got here, another slide. I've got something we've tried over the years, and particularly for our younger learners, it's become probably more relevant and provides a relevant measuring task. In fact, we're very lucky with measuring. Most of the tasks you can do with learners are relevant and authentic and social, as opposed to being one person sitting down working something out. Here people can get off their chairs, get their blood flowing and be active. That's actually really important, I think, for adult learners and for adolescent learners. Make sure you have supplies of scissors and tape, measuring tape, different coloured paper if you're going to ask them to make something up like this, and observe how they do it. What I particularly like about this one is that one of the measures that you ask them to make, they've got to perhaps appreciate that there's no width on either side of the L. So where do they place the L on the yellow background? Centrally, some sort of hint of symmetry, or it's interesting to observe. and of course using millimetres, which in construction trades and engineering is one of the go-to units. Yeah, so try that one. I did one, actually, Fran, you might remember in Dunedin, where we did this particular one going back 2 or 3 years, and someone did something pretty clever. They cut out the L out of the yellow and then used the black background and sat the yellow on top of that. Don't tell the learners, let them have a crack at it themselves. So, as an activity, I'm sure you can find other things, all from your courses, that are very useful to have a bit of a play with. But give them a go at it, and if it helps to do it in pairs, well and good. So, just wanted to close up the session. We talked about possible benchmarks, and based on the human dimensions they might know. The great thing about that, of course, is that we count these things around with us. So you say, well, how many hand spans is that? Or because a hand span could be about 20 centimetres or 200 millimetres. Very, very useful. Invite them to investigate using accessible activities. You might like to think that that particular L plate thingamajig that we got you to look at could be useful. Well, you're most welcome to use that. You've got probably other things that you might like to try as well. Get them to do follow a recipe. Get them to read some instructions of perhaps paint and look at the number of square metres perhaps that the paint could relate to. So sometimes the maths is not as complex as the task. And with measurement, with the demands of measurement, of course, there's a lot of literacy integrated with the numeracy, and it's a good means of assessing their ability to read for understanding as well. Observe the measuring unfolding before you, their technique, how accurate they are, who does the measuring, understanding scale units, etc., and of course, how accurate they target it, how precise they need to be. Sometimes some of you will have used the online assessment tool, and that's paper-based, which is very useful. It gives you a little bit of an inkling about who can do conversions, etc. But those of you who have also seen the books, these ones, the green-covered book, Teaching Adults to Measure and Interpret Shape and Space. It's on the NCLANA website. What I particularly like out of here, on pages 8 and 9, a couple of assessment tasks. One task I've used quite a lot is getting them to look at a big, thick textbook or something, of which we've got heaps of, and get them to estimate its weight and its width, and then get them to do some measuring. And that could be anything from lengths to perimeters. They might calculate areas, they might calculate volumes, and there's some converting as well. So that gives you a means to assess them quite quickly over 10 to 15 minutes. Okay, so on pages 8 to 9 of this book here, there's some good stuff, as well as the other bits, of course. Finally, look through your own course materials. Identify any measuring demands, including scales which need to be read. You need to be proactive and try and think in advance of those little bottlenecks that our learners might come to. But by all means, give them a go, because measuring is a practical set of activities. Okay? Alright, I've just about done my dash here, but just a couple of things to finish off. Don't forget also to think about the location thing. Can they give directions? And ask them also about their own interests. What do? They made a list of things that they did on the way to your place of learning. Pick out the measurement activities there. You know, how much do they feed the pet before they came? What do? They might have checked the gas on the tank if they were driving. Okay? Lots of things, some of them are invisible to them unless you give them a chance to pull them out. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope that it's been of some use, and good luck with your measuring. Ka kite. Thank you.